I thought I would talk a little bit about Cuba, but I'm here to talk a little bit about everything. Now it's a little bit easier to get there. I think that you don't absolutely have to go with a tour if you don't have a connection, a relative, etc. The people-to-people thing is available to individuals now. You just have to have kind of an itinerary full-time. You can't be a tourist in Cuba, because the reality is, the legality is that it's illegal to really spend money in Cuba. As a street photographer, I found Cuba to be just an amazing place, especially for the first time, because you're not quite prepared for it. I mean, there's so much beauty, not only in the people, but in these kind of decaying buildings and structures that are all around you. So just the way Cartier-Bresson was inspired when he saw this picture in 32, he made the comment. But when you look at that picture on the right by Martin Munkazi, it doesn't look like a picture that was made in 1929, does it? Because at that time, I think maybe the highest ISO was like 50. And that kind of frozen moment is a little uncharacteristic of the time. So you can imagine Cartier-Bresson and the light bulb going off, and how it kind of inspired him and his long career. When in Cuba, because we're there for such a short time, you want to be out there. And we're out there in the day, in the night. I mean, there's never really a bad time as a street photographer, because it's always interesting. When you go there for the first time, it's a different political system. And I think there's a reverence for artists in Cuba. The artist is the revolutionary, and of course we know the history of Cuba. And I think that the artist is respected in Cuba. But more importantly, as a photographer, I think you can put on that label and wear it. You don't have to shout it out. But Cuba's a place that lets you kind of roam free. And I think I talk to the students about getting the most out of the experience, and that is to be open. I think that a lot of us, including myself, tend to shoot from a little bit of a formulary thing. We all have our comfort zone. I think we sometimes shoot from a sort of standing position, a certain subject distance. I think you got to sort of shake yourself out of that and see what things look like in places that you normally don't go. And that's not always easy, but it gets you out of your comfort zone. So I think it's a good time to experiment, to follow your curiosity, as opposed to be thinking about what it is that you think is going to be a strong photo, or pictures that you've seen. Nothing wrong with emulating, but to kind of make it personal. Because as Deanne Arbus said, the more personal you make it, the more universal it becomes. We're all unique. We all have a unique perspective. The more you can tap into that, the more you can tap into your reactions and your curiosity when you're out shooting, the stronger your work will become. I think, too, that when you're framing, that first shot is the starting point. So you want to eye to the camera, see what things look like. So that first shot you take, and then from there, you experiment, move around, and really try and get as much as you can within the frame. And for me, it's my own discipline. I like to live within the frame, and by that I mean I will crop, and I'm cropping all the time, but I'll keep the same ratio, the 3:2 ratio of my DSLR. And now with cameras that have this multitude of megapixels, and especially on the street, I think the main thing is to sort of capture it if it's a moment, get it sharp if sharpness is important. And then from there, often I'm composing on the computer, moving that box around for maximum impact. Don't think too much. You're reacting, you're feeling your way through. And ultimately, everything I say coincides with an ability to use your equipment in a fairly seamless way so that it doesn't get in the way. If you're planning on doing a workshop, it's really more important to be familiar with the tool that you're using so it doesn't get in the way of what you're trying to capture and as you're experiencing things. So I turn my image review off so that the picture doesn't pop up and distract me or entice me, seduce me. I want to be in the moment shooting. And I know there are some situations photographically where, yeah, it makes sense for that picture to pop up if you're shooting on a tripod or you're doing fireworks. You want to see, did I get it? And you can easily turn it back on, but I generally don't. I want to just react, and I don't want to edit. I don't want to edit in the camera because I can't make those decisions in the field. Not only should you not on a small little screen because you're not going to see subtlety, but you're too involved and it's not a time. It's a time to just make the images and then later sort of see what happens. So the moment is all important, and that requires, it's really a matter of having a premonition, because you look for visual potential and then you know that there are moments that are going to happen, because if you want to capture the moment, you're there and you're ready and you capture it. You know, if the girl's blowing bubbles once, she's going to blow bubbles again. If someone yawns once, they'll probably yawn again. The mantra of less is more. I think there's freedom in small and light. And if you make a decision to go out one day with a 35 millimeter lens, or if you want to, not limit yourself, you have a zoom, one camera, you live within the focal length of that lens, which means you've got to move in. And if you see something that would have been a great telephoto shot, you save it, or you just remember it in your mind, and you do an artist sketch for people later, but you don't have it. I mean, there's plenty you can get with what you have. The other thing I've learned, and this is something we see often, and that is the edges of the frame that sometimes hurt people. So for street shooters, I recommend be a little bit looser, because you can always crop in, but you can't really crop out. Have a little bit of breathing space. So that comes again with a little more experience. Work it, don't give up on it. The more time you spend, usually the better it gets. And then the idea of pacing yourself, I think, is important. These kids were at a school. The first time I went to Cuba, I went with my wife, and so she's a teacher, so as part of it, she gave a little talk at a school, so this was a school. But I think just like in any pursuit, I mean, you only have a certain amount of time where you need to kind of take a break. You got to pace yourself. If you're being employed and on a job, sometimes it means, really cracking the whip and working through the tiredness and whatever. But as a photographer, as a creative person, I think you can decide to, okay, I got to take a break. I mean, you're so in the moment, hopefully, when you're out shooting, that it's good to take a break. And if you've ever worked on a letter or a story or a book, you realize that there's a point where you might as well stop because it's not helping, and then you come back and everything's clearer again. Obviously, the light is important, and the thing about Havana, because old Havana is kind of pretty dense and pretty put together, fairly close, the architecture, there's all kinds of sort of soft reflected light. So at times when normally the harsh noonday light would not necessarily lend itself well to photography, it does work very well in a place like Havana, the texture, the decaying stuff. So there really is no bad light, and that's the bad news for us, and that is there's really no time necessarily to take a break. Different angles, of course. This was taken across from the hotel that the workshop stays in at the Anglaterra. There's a restaurant roof deck, and it's not like New York City. Those of you that have been there, you don't have to show your ID to get into a building. You can often sort of wander up to the roof and start shooting, and people are generally okay with it. I will say though that tourism is still kind of a big deal for Cuba, and it's getting very busy, and it's only going to get busier. There is no slow season anymore in Havana just because of the interest. But anyway, there's all kinds of opportunities to get really interesting angles. And this is just all photography, sort of the rhythm of your composition, and it's a matter of moments. And on the street, I sort of compare the elements as kind of chess pieces. You can't really control them, but how you control them is by when you trip the shutter. And that's when the chess pieces freeze. And that's why you have to shoot a lot more, because when you get that kind of interesting synchronicity within the frame, it's very interesting, and it's probably a stronger shot. And then there's the rhythm of place, because you're in a place that maybe you're unfamiliar with. And in my experience, it's best to sort of stay in one place longer than just constantly be on the move. You're not your typical tourist as a photographer when you're going on a trip like this, because again, you're looking to find something interesting, and when you do, you want to kind of stick it out. Because again, after some time, you start to feel more comfortable in the place. The place starts to feel more comfortable with this photographer in the place, and you start to see things that you wouldn't normally see. You're missing because you're kind of reacting and unsure, but the longer you're there, the better it gets. I think it's a good idea to consider telling a story on the street. So, there's different kinds of street photography, but I think that, for me anyway, the strongest pictures kind of allow the viewer to kind of rattle around within the frame and maybe begin to use their imagination and imagine a story. It may not be the story or the correct story, but it will be a story, and it's often kind of interesting. So I think at the very least, the thread of Havana new love letter as a theme is really kind of wide open. So it's how you kind of interpret it. It could be sort of actual in terms of images of people reacting in a sort of lovely way. But having the storied approach, I think, you may not know what it is until you start, but once you start, you see a little bit of a connection that excites you photographically, that allows you to go back and still shoot all the stuff that you normally would, but also have a bit more direction where you start to get excited about, I'm telling a little story here that somehow I'm attracted to about this place. Signs are important too when you're telling your story, and of course in Cuba, not only do you see the architecture, but you'll see sort of the fading remnants of the past, if you will, and the future as well in terms of the signs. And detailed pictures should not be ignored because they'll also help tell your story. But they're not just a one-off. You want to treat each detail as if it's a portrait. You want to make the strongest image, do the compositional dance, frame it in the same way, I think is a good idea. Food, I think it's nice to have that sort of global approach when you go on a photographic trip. To tell the story to the people you love, but then there's, pulling out the strongest images and taking the photography a little more seriously. Do I have enough to really kind of tell a story beyond my family in a way that really works? And, the food is an important part. Everyone can relate to it. Photography is a universal language like music, and we understand it, and we all understand food as well. If things aren't working, get back and just keep get out there again. Don't give up. Don't give up on it. In my experience, I remember as a younger photojournalist hearing the words of Melissa Farlow, this great National Geographic photographer, back in the film days. I've mentioned this before, but she described that she really worked the assignment. And with film, maybe you worked a little harder because you couldn't tell if you got it, so you wanted to shoot some insurance. But after the 5 rolls of working with her subject, she would take that extra memory card or extra roll of film, put it in, and then sometimes there's a bit of a breakthrough and something happens that is a little bit magic. And have a plan, so when you're doing sort of the storied approach, you may start to see some connections. It's okay to have a plan. Leave your comfort zone, get in tight. You're always respectful, but at the same time, you're bold. Be safe. The one thing I noticed in Cuba, and it's very safe. And we do a lot of work at night, and night is a magical time. It's pretty safe. Now, there are places to go, obviously, in this world, and New Yorkers are pretty street smart, where things can be a little bit iffy, and so we let you know about that. And we're often off the beaten track that it's more interesting. The last thing you want to see is all these tourists, even though maybe you look like a tourist, but you don't see yourself. You just see this. So as long as you take yourself out, when you're in a place that is authentically real, it's pretty exciting, and it's very safe. The other thing too about Cuba, and I haven't seen too many of these interiors, is I encourage students that many times it's open, because the buildings are so old, those that have been there, there is no door. You can just walk right in, and people invite you to see their home, and that's a great opportunity if you're willing to get out of your comfort zone a little bit and go with that, because you're going to be safe, and especially if you're in a situation where there's a group not too far away, but even if you're traveling with someone else, that is a very powerful way to see a real side of Cuba that you're not going to see if you just stick to the tourist thing. But going out at night is a beautiful thing, and now with our sensors being so sensitive, we can turn up the volume on our sensors without having the distortion. It's pretty amazing. So we're in that golden age, and the night in Havana is really quite amazing. And it's all around, it feels very safe, and it's kind of exciting to be in a place that you feel comfortable that looks like you shouldn't be that comfortable in. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're able to get images that normally you wouldn't necessarily be wanting to take, and that is kind of exciting. You know, one of the things I'll say to people is, when you're in a place, you know, what are the 5 words that sort of are your impression of that place? Cuba, you know, crumbling, energy, you know, smiling. And having those key words can be used when you're out on the street, in that they can be used as a thread to connect the images that you're taking. So for example, when you're, you know, they're not so much literal, but just sort of an energy. If you feel a certain kind of energy, when you think about shooting a scene, does that scene have the energy, or it just doesn't, so maybe you need to move on. It helps to kind of keep your level high when it comes to your photography and keep you moving sort of higher than maybe you would normally. So that's something to think about as well. The other thing too is, as a street photographer, I tend to like the intimacy of a wide-angle lens, but I've adjusted my thinking when it comes to Cuba, because as part of the equipment you bring, if you did bring something with some reach, and maybe those that have been there, like a 70 to 200 or something like that, because there are a lot of images like this, people up on their balconies, and if you have a 35 or an 85, it's just not going to be enough. But it's not like you're trying to sort of serendipitously, you know, paparazzi the scene. It's the only way to truly get the scene the way you would see it, because you can't physically get into a place that would best depict that scene. So I think in Cuba, it's not a bad idea to have, you don't have to have it with you all the time, but you know, something that's a little bit longer. And it will allow you to isolate, you know, the architecture and some of the scenes that you see happening above you. I think it's important when people come on a workshop to Cuba, if it's only for a week, that they leave with a kind of a nice portfolio that they're proud of, but you totally will. But at the same time, it's also a great time to experiment or to push yourself to try something a little bit new, and you know, get your work to sort of a new place. And thank you very much for being here.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.